Our next talk is by Philipp Schaumann. He will be talking about higher order effects when introducing autonomous cars. When talking about autonomous car, we are often thinking about calling a car from the internet by talking with your watch. But we're seeing what's happening outside. Cars are becoming more and more intelligent, and the future will look differently than we imagine. We will have autonomous cars, but what will they look like? And the question is not only what are the benefits, but also what could the risks be? What are the consequences also in the long term on society? So I'm happy to have Philipp Schaumann here today to discuss, because Philipp has been active in IT for ages, since the 70s. He's a counselor, mainly for security questions or organizational, but also with societal or psychological aspects, which fits our topic perfectly. As a security expert, he is working for banks in Vienna, but he's also publishing his research. So if you like this presentation, you can have a look at his research. So let's just head right in and start. The stage is yours, Philipp.
Thank you very much. That's a beautiful introduction. Checking the consequences of technology. I had to make a study. What happens when we introduce autonomous or connected, linked vehicles? And I had to read a lot of studies, and it was absolutely awful because they were always thought too short. And I'd like to stand up here and say how you should really think it out. There's a load of links on my website. It's a PDF, and it's in the ParivacyWeek in the schedule. Just go there, look my talk, and you download it, and you can load the PDFs and look at all. Let's have a look at it. I'm not talking only about autonomous vehicles. And Daimler said, Mercedes basically said, we have to talk about linked or shared. And that means we're talking electric cars, and that means shared cars. And if we take all that together, there's a lot of problems that are connected. We should have to have secure connections between IT systems. I mean, vehicles today are cars, are PCs as well, aren't they? And do we have secure connections? And when you build up connections into the internet, that's a big building site. Autonomous means also great advances in artificial intelligence. Recognition of objects still cheatable. Sensors, we'll talk about that later, have to become a lot cheaper. The whole electronic within all vehicles is an enormous. In Germany, for instance, we have this mix of private and public buildings. And how do you load your electric car? And who's gonna pay for digging up all the roads and putting new cables, because the existing back system will not support all those additional loading stations? No, you don't have to read this, client. It's not planned. Then that's the New York Times, and the New York Times ran a very long article. Autonomous driving will completely reverse our society. Where do we buy? Where do we shop? Shouldn't we make our streets completely different? At the moment, our streets are made for steered cars. Do we have to change that? Let's have a look what we need from this graphic. Single points. What do they mean? Autonomous. How high is the fascination of the population with autonomy? And well, it's sort of limited. First of all, they're expensive. They need a lot of sensors and a lot of computing power. And the experience is expensive. Now, sensors can make a vehicle a lot more expensive. If you add that on top of an electronic or electric car, electric drivetrain, there is no such thing as a cheap electric car. Those vehicles are not very interesting for a broad mass market. I mean, yeah, nerds will buy them, I mean, look at the price of a Tesla. Okay. Now, there's two different implementations of how does a car look. One is Volvo, and the other one is I can't read it, to be quite honest. Ford, excuse me. The Ford Fusion, think 20 cameras are the thing to have, and 7 LiDAR radars. Volvo has one on its roof. Now, when there's one camera on the roof, it cannot see what is happening right in front of your car. You need a lot more, actually. You don't only need more sensors, not only the cost of the sensors, it's not only the additional cost of the sensor, all the software becomes more complex. Making the sensor itself cheaper it's only half of the game, because the other half is you have to computing power is expensive. If I want autonomous vehicles that are safe, I need high-class sensors and a lot of computing power, and that's going to be expensive. And there's a lot of studies. Says, with autonomous vehicles, there won't be any accidents anymore because they can avoid all the human errors. No, it's not true. The simple and cheap cars that will go into the market will be the Teslas that run into all kind of odd things. Well, we've been in the news. There was a sensor there's a decision. There was a bicycle driver who was pushing his bike, and she could the car could identify it and ran right over it. There's a lot of challenge to make a safe vehicle. It's doable. Google has proved it. Google has never had an accident in their tests, but they spent about $1 million on a vehicle. One won't work that way. Won't work in the mass market. The additional price will work only when you can have some additional savings, and that's when we can save a workplace. That's why autonomous vehicles are in companies, on airports, on the tarmac, within production halls. The next thing that, my opinion, will be autonomous cabs, taxis. Not everywhere, with a fixed grid of streets, and I can see that coming because that might work. But in the private sector and out in the free country, out in the countryside, that won't come. Next thing is autonomous trucks or lorries. They do a definite tour. They don't have to stop. They don't have to park anywhere. They don't have to make pauses. They go to a particular point, and there a driver will pick them up and locally take them to where they're unloaded. Now that might be a good idea to follow. I think these kind of vehicles will come pretty soon, but for financial reasons. We could run a convoy. Several trucks, one behind the other. Call that platooning. Now, there's a dramatic possibility of cost reduction when introducing driverless trucks or lorries. What does that mean for the train service, freight train service? I mean, train services are not making a lot of money in train freight as it is at the moment. But freight on a truck will become so cheap that I don't think train systems will be able to cope with that. But we'll see that. Okay. All these autonomous vehicles need current. We'll have to electrify the freeway. Trucks with electricity rail, excuse me. Who's going to pay for the infrastructure installing? Oh, we could partially privatize. We could have one of these public-private partnerships, one of these corporations. They might participate. Here we go. And where do we get all the electricity? It would be nice if that would be renewable. I think there are going to be some gas turbines and some nuclear power stations. And it won't, if traffic goes autonomous, environment won't be that happy. Let's go and look, next step, how to finance this infrastructure. And we'll talk about that later. Talk about autonomous taxis or cabs. Uber and Lyft have convinced cities to give up their bus service, and they convinced some cities in the US they will give up their bus services, and they with the free financial means, we will finance the infrastructure that you need. Might be a bit more expensive, but it's door to door. It's easier to run, and it's beautiful. And those without a driving license, and the old ones, and the blind ones, and those that can't drive. Well, I'm not so sure that could have some consequences. If taxis become definitely cheaper, because you don't have to pay a driver because the car drives itself. So everybody changes from private public transport. So buses will run with a greater interval between, and that'll be a nice feedback. And public transport will go from bad to worse. And what does that mean when you have more queue? I mean, look at Manhattan even before Corona, because Uber is so cheap, and that puts more cars on the street. And people would decide, do you want to sit in a nicely climatized Uber or in a stinky subway? And they said, oh, great, we'll take the Uber. And now they're queuing. With Corona, that is exploding now. Some public transport systems have completely given up at the moment. We'll talk about that later. It's your go at the moment. What about those people that can't afford such cheap, but still to pay Uber taxes? Or what about those regions out in the countryside where there might be a bus 3 times a day, but anyhow, there is a bus, but Uber is too expensive to go out there.
What is positive about autonomous driving, or what is always advertised as positive, is that there's mobility for target audiences who can't afford a taxi. For example, old people or people with disabilities. But that will mean more CO2. And then it is often said that if taxis are so comfortable, people will switch from their private vehicles to public taxis. And if you take a taxi to the city, we can get rid of the parking lots in the city. But the next question will be, if we don't need private cars, if you've ever tried to build in a child seat in a car or a taxi, you will know the struggle, and you will know why people need their own vehicle, for example, to accommodate their children or to listen to their own music, stuff like that. If people use autonomous cars to go to the city, if there's no parking lots, they could send home their vehicles, but that would generate twice as much traffic, which would mean even more CO2. So this isn't really a green technology, even though studies often say autonomous cars will save so much CO2. But I don't believe so. New mobility concepts are trying to supersede existing mobility concepts. I've mentioned New York City and all of the traffic jams because of Uber, because people like using Uber instead of the crowded subway. But there's more that we need to discuss. If I want to use Uber, I need an app. I can't call an Uber without an app. So anyone who can't use apps for whatever reason is excluded from Uber automatically. For example, if you're visually impaired. And that is a restriction. You can still take the bus, but as we said, public transport might not have a future. And for those people who don't have the apps or who can't afford the autonomous taxis, will just have to stay home. So there's a selection going on. Also, Uber rates not just the customers, but also the drivers. And maybe if you have bad Uber ratings, you won't be able to find a driver if you've misbehaved the day before. But we have even more wild consequences. In some US cities, Lyft and Uber are trying to convince cities to get rid of public transport because the argument is that that buses are just outdated. In New York in 2018, there were that there was public money being given to private transport providers. And Uber did a technology switch for subways. And it was said that it would be bad to invest in old technologies, and they were trying to convince the cities to give up their own their old subways to Uber. So they were basically trying to privatize subway. That isn't happening quite in that extreme measures in Europe, but still, this could be coming towards us. Talking about positive and negative ramifications of autonomous cars. For example, elderly people who have lost their driver's license or who shouldn't be driving because of physical impairments will have more options of going to the city, for example, but traffic will increase because one bus accommodates a whole traffic jam of people. So that would mean that we would have to build more roads if we want to accommodate a fleet of autonomous cars. And if those are all sent home because they're not needed, we need a lot of parking lots and even more roads. Those are all ramifications that are often overlooked, because often you say for old people, autonomous traffic is great, but it also has negative ramifications. But now I would like to talk about something positive. Autonomous buses would be something I would really wish for, because bus driver costs are a large factor. At the moment, we don't need, if we don't need drivers anymore, we could have smaller buses, and the smaller buses could have better schedules and drive more, go more often. If you have a larger offer, better schedules, we have a better competition against Uber and Lyft. Those would be great effects. So that technology of autonomous car, if we take the right political decisions, can be transferred to ecologically sensible purposes. But investing public money into Uber and Lyft is a very bad idea, and I fear that this will happen. How can you finance those expensive technologies and infrastructures? The answer is, in short, PPP, private-public partnerships. Surprise, surprise, Google's already in. Since 2017, they've been financing infrastructure for cities for free. Isn't that just great? And they only want our data in exchange, the data of everyone who uses the public infrastructure. And you don't have a possibility to opt out. In New York, you already have that. If you pass a Google station with your mobile phone, they track you, and they already have nice tracking of all of New York City's residents. Of course, they're not doing that because they're philanthropists. No, they want to use public data. Sidewalk Labs is a branch office of Google. And in Toronto, there were public initiatives against those measures, and there was a lot of political discussion. There's already movements in New York as well against this data collection at large scale. Now, let's talk about a very interesting topic. What if autonomous and normal traffic doesn't mix? Because that's a very real possibility. I can imagine an all autonomous traffic very well. But as soon as there's a mix between autonomous and traditional traffic, there's going to be a lot of problems. Because it's going to be about who will win, the autonomous traffic lobbyists or the traditional traffic lobbyists. I'm not so sure. Option 1, would be having separate lanes for autonomous and traditional traffic. But you would have to enclose them in fences because animals or humans might want to cross the street. So we would need fences to secure the autonomous traffic. This takes massive funds. Who will finance this? Well, Google. But if you want to use the street, then you'll have to accept Google's end user license agreement. And if you don't, there's no using the road. And if you have problems installing the software, you're bad. Another option would be banning traditional traffic. And I can almost imagine that this would happen. We would still have pedestrians to worry about, but that would completely destroy used car dealerships. And it would lead to a whole different level of public uprisings because what would people do with their old vehicles? People would probably switch to sharing providers, and traffic would maybe have the same volume. And honestly, it makes me a bit afraid, not for myself, but for my potential children and grandchildren. Intelligent, linked infrastructure can only accommodate autonomous traffic if you have the right intermesh technologies. If you have cars collaborating with traffic lights, if you have an electronic system with phased traffic lights, you can use the capacities of intersections much better. There's a lot of creative potential here, but you won't be able to use it without the corresponding apps. I think it was a University von Bremen in Germany that said that traffic lights will communicate conditions to cars, and then the cars will determine what car will cross the intersection at what time. So the cars will autonomously brake just enough so that there will be no collisions and no traffic jams. But what about pedestrians and people who are riding bikes, cyclists? The best option would be prohibiting them. Or you would have to build bridges that they could use. There can be solutions, but I can't imagine a solution that would be advantageous to cyclists and pedestrians, because the negotiations will be done by the car lobbies and not the pedestrian lobbies. So private partners are a must in this regard. And those private partners will at least want our data as payments. And that will make states, again, interested in those data because they would also want to use the data for their purposes. Because it creates a very neat movement profile, and that would mean more transparent citizens. So we're heading towards a digital divide. The question is, will I even be able to move in public space without using digital technologies? Maybe if I don't have a mobile phone, or if I don't use Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. Maybe in the future, if I don't use those technologies, I won't be able to cross the street. What about cash? Will I even be able to pay without cash? In a traditional taxi, I can still pay by cash, but with Uber, that's not possible. The drivers aren't even allowed to take cash. So our beautiful, brave new world has a whole different face when we look at those ramifications. Now we're going to get to the more detailed pages. What about car mechanics? Because if we don't have collisions, we wouldn't need car mechanics, right? And wouldn't it be nice to have a world without collisions? No more cyclists, no more pedestrians, no more drunk drivers. So we don't need car mechanics, we don't need driving schools, we don't need driving licenses. We need new insurance schemes. Cars will be insured, not people. Cars could even become juridical persons. If we get rid of traffic lights, if we get rid of traffic signs, who needs street names anyway? Because everyone uses Google Maps, right? Or Open Street View for those who are listening to this talk. Who needs street names? Who still uses street names? Public traffic will be completely different than we know it. Then what about movement profiles? It started very harmlessly 100 years ago. We had horse carriages, and later those carriages got motors. Curiously, we had electric cars first, and afterwards we had combustion engines. And then people were so glad to be rid of the problem with horse shit on the streets. But what about collisions? Somebody said. 50 years later, we have mobility for everyone. And today, we have a lot of collisions because of high speeds. We have carbohydrates being blown into the air. We have landscapes shaped by traffic. And by the way, the problem of collisions was recognized right away and solutions were found. For example, cars had like a basket that could catch stray pedestrians. My wife told me that in 1950 in Vienna, we still had trams who had baskets in front of the carriage so that people couldn't throw themselves in front of a tram, as you can see on the image here. But those are only make-believe solutions. But let's look at the current numbers of collisions and deaths because of traffic. It's a real massacre on our streets. If people in 1900 had known that 100 years later, every 25 seconds, a person would be killed by a vehicle, I don't know if they would have thought of our problems today.
Here's the summary. We are trying to enter something, and politics is fascinated, and everybody's going for, we have to have tests for autonomous drivers, and politics, this is great, and we are those that know. Great pressure for lobbies from companies, a lot of fantasy, what great things could happen, and the fascination of political seems to be unbreakable. The power with which politicians engage is quite incredible. This brings me to an end, and maybe there are questions. I can't hear you, Pooper. You're muted. Here we are. Do it the other way around. Yeah, I have a mic. You can use it. Thank you very much for that talk. And I live in Berlin, and there's a lot of things we test here in Berlin. We just try a popular initiative for a city center without car, with arguing how this should go on. This is quite fascinating. Only 50% of households in Berlin still own a car today. That's going to be some fascinating development. Vienna is the same. Vienna, about 50% of households still own model mixes. Cars, Corona changed that. Oh, yeah. In Berlin, a lot of more share services came up. And like mushrooms after the brain, shooting out of, and you just get in and you don't have to think about, you can park them anywhere as a user. That's beautiful. See, I don't have a car since 12 years and I've never missed it. But what does that mean for the subway system? Yeah, that might be the call for action. We have to ask or demand politically that politics should enter and not only upkeep public transport, but enhance it. We'll have to start another initiative. Autonomous buses, yeah, for instance. Okay. Oh, yeah. You said Google. You remember that Google capture where it says, this is a traffic light, this is a car? Yeah. Are you quite sure Google can? Oh, we're training the algorithm of Google by doing that. Yeah. Okay. Oh, we share, and everybody's collecting information. Thank you, but thank you very much. That was Philip Schaumann with a very fascinating view into the future, giving us some pulses how we could hang on